Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Boys in the Cave. Today, this is Josh, joined by my regular co-host Rafael, and we have a very special guest with us today, which is Dr. Salim Farrar. Now, Dr. Salim Farrar is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Sydney, where he lectures in Sharia and Common Law. He first graduated from King's College in London and received his doctorate from the University of Warwick in Islamic and English Criminal Law. He studied the Islamic sciences both at the feet of traditional scholars across the Muslim world and graduated from the Islamic University of Malaysia, where he was also an associate professor. His principal research and teaching interests are in Islamic law, criminal justice, and human rights, with a particular focus on Southeast Asia and the Middle East. He also closely studies Muslims in the West and their interaction with the law. He speaks English, Arabic, Bahasa Malaysian, and French, and has just written a book on the reforms of the Malaysian criminal process. So, how are you today, Dr. Slim?
We'll get straight into the big topics, and that's the fact that it's 38 degrees in Sydney today.
In Sydney today.
Yeah, I think so. And you were in Geneva last time, so
it's 5 degrees.
Yeah, bit of a temperature difference there. What were you doing there? So what was the
I was at an experts working group at the International Centre of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So I was invited along with 20 others from across the Muslim world and also Muslims in the non-Muslim world. And we were looking at the interaction between international humanitarian law and Islamic law, and some of the problems which the ICRC have in the field, where you may have Muslims who they take people from the battlefield, and then what do they do with their prisoners, and then do they allow access to people from the relief agencies, and also what happens during disasters, and how we look after bodies, and how we treat people appropriately in these situations, what are the rules, values, regulations, and where are the differences essentially between international humanitarian law, international humanitarian law, and Islamic law, and what are the challenges, and what can we do to meet them and resolve them. So it was a start of that process. This was the first meeting that they'd had. There have been some other meetings and other fora in relation to human rights and Islamic law, but international humanitarian law, strangely, they haven't had this close rapport before. So it was part of that process.
How is the relationship, would you say, between human rights law, as it's enshrined in the United Nations, the Declaration of Human Rights, and Islamic law? I remember studying something called the Cairo Declaration.
Correct.
Which is like what would you describe it as? Like an Islamic Declaration of Human Rights?
My response initially to that would be, depends who you talk to. There are many non-Muslim critics refer to it as an Islamic apologist response, and that it doesn't fully incorporate some of the rules and values of international human rights, and it specifically excludes certain things from its operation. Others would say it is looking at human rights within an Islamic framework, and it's responding to various issues which have been brought up by the human rights discourse and giving them almost say maybe an Islamic spin. The criticism of it from the Islamic side is that maybe it takes too much of the influence from the human rights discourse, and it makes certain or adopts certain positions which might not be concordant with the traditional heritage, Islamic heritage. So there are some tensions which need to be resolved, but it is very much a compromise between different traditions, which in a way has been a feature of the interaction between Islamic law at the national and international level, because we're living in a post-caliphate world where Islamic frameworks are not the first option of a state and international governments.
Of course, and I think that it's very difficult to kind of grapple with, obviously these Islamic political structures have long collapsed, and so we're kind of here left in this very strange world, the traditional Islam, with all these pieces, and we have, the issue of kind of a vacuum of traditional knowledge in a lot of ways, and then kind of the political and economic issues that have plagued the Muslim world post-colonialism, and it's very difficult. But how do we, as Muslims, and this is, I guess, the crux of everything, how do we pick up these pieces of our tradition and bring that into this modern world? how do we engage with ideas such as human rights being at the forefront of morality? How do they compare to our understandings of morality? Because that's fundamentally what it would come down to, moral teachings. You
have to go back to basics first of all, and to remember that Islamic government, I stress the word government, wasn't at the beginning of things. When the Prophet ﷺ came in the first 13 years of his mission, there was no Islamic government. So you had peoples, you had Muslims, and the majority, of course, were non-Muslim even in the surrounding areas. And so Islam needed to be spread, the Aqidah needed to be spread and emphasized, and the Muslims needed to act upon this in their daily lives. And so Islam was a sense of values and morality. It wasn't manifested in the governmental rules or the forms of government that they had. And even after that, of course, we had Medinan government after the Hijrah. But there have been periods in our Islamic history where there's been lots of disjunctures between the Islamic paradigms and what was actually happening in practice. So just because things may not exactly replicate what is in our governments, what is in the rules, and what we would aspire to, doesn't mean somehow it's impossible to live an Islamic way of life. We can do it, and we are always works in progress, individually, within our families, within our communities, and to remember that we're this work in progress, I think helps to instill in us a sense of humility and what we should be doing and what we should be aspiring towards.
I think coming from a historical perspective, just getting a bit deeper into human rights, the idea of human rights in international law sort of came out of a European context very much, of Europe descending into its total chaos, I guess, with World War II, and coming up with some, moral justification of holding the world together. And a lot of, I think, critical scholars have pointed out that in its heritage, there are a lot of Christian influences, and a lot of things which, are given like a secular garb and made to apply to the whole world. And that's what human rights is. We take it to be this universal set of principles which sets down what is just for all of humanity, but it just was formulated like less than a century ago. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize. Islam has its own principles in a way of coming to what lays at the foundation of rights, justice, and law for the human being. And a lot of, some of my professors have mentioned that as, post-colonial nations dealing with this heritage, you don't have to throw out the whole idea of human rights to come to a properly Islamic, conception of, your nation. Would you agree in that sense? As in we can use what human rights has provided us and sort of Islamify it in a way? Not, like the Cairo Declaration, but wield it for our own political ends, or trying to live as a Muslim community.
There's a lot to unpack there. And first of all, if we get back to the historical issue, that the Universal Declaration in 1948, the vast majority of Muslim countries at that time were under the colonial yoke.
Yes.
And
still were.
So it was a manifestation really of imperialism and of the imperial powers coming together, and they compromised. So when it said it's a universal declaration, we need to qualify that.
Definitely.
And to say, it was only universal in the sense that it had the values of the Chinese, the values of the Russians, the values of the Americans and the British and the French, which came together, and they were able to compromise to form these various rules and principles. Now, Saudi Arabia at that time was an independent state, and they abstained from the Universal Declaration, which I think is an important point. They abstained from it, and there were some Egyptians who were members of the committee, but not quite clear as to how they viewed Islamic law or religion. So Islamic values weren't incorporated within it. Now, what has happened since that time is that Muslim countries have become independent, and so we're living in a decolonized world. And that post-colonial process, Muslim countries they were reacting against human rights as being a manifestation of Western will, largely.
Yeah.
The Russians and the Chinese also saw it really as part of the Western tradition, not so much of their tradition. And so attempts to enforce it were seen as attempts to impose the West to impose itself on the East and on the South.
Definitely, yeah.
But to what extent, if we probe more deeply, do we find values maybe of human rights within Islamic tradition? Well, if we were to translate the terms human rights, first of all, into Arabic, it's حقوق إنسانية. Now, you don't find this term, حقوق إنسانية, within the Quran or in the Hadith literature or in the fiqh literature. It's non-existent. It's a neologism. It's a new word. So we find, for example, Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah in some of his contemporary works referring to it, but recognizing this is a new expression to give account of what's going on today. Now, what does the Islamic tradition talk about? It talks about حقوق الآدمي, the rights of the children of Adam. So these are rights which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has embedded within the Quran, embedded within the Sunnah, which the fuqaha have then extracted through ahkam and imposing rights and obligations on the communities. But حقوق الآدمية and حقوق Allah, so the rights of Allah, the rights of human beings, they may have many similarities in some of the aspects of the treaties and of the conventions and declarations, but also there may be some very important differences, and as has been mentioned by many commentators, issues pertaining to equality between genders, that has been and continues to be a very important sticking point. Issues about religion and apostasy continue to be a very major sticking point. Issues with regard to the hudud and the implementation of the hudud remain a sticking point. So there are a whole number of areas which are problematic in contemporary human rights discourse, and which remain a question for us to continue to try to navigate.
Would you say the maqasid are sort of, which is I guess the principles of the preservation of human life, is that like something that we can analogize to human rights in a way? As in, this is what Islam says about what it means to preserve human life in the same way that human rights sort of claims to? As in, would that be one example? As in, that's what I'm thinking of, but I can't.
The 5 fundamentals, some scholars talk about 6, refer to ard or honor, and in a way that 6th one is also a sticking point. So to what extent in the modern era do we want to emphasize the rights to honor, because it has all sorts of people say unpleasant connotations with people killing their families, their daughters, and so that's an issue which is problematic. So to what extent does it really replicate all of these things? I think you have to look at the details of it, as opposed to drawing analogies from one on another.
Absolutely. I suppose I've seen a phenomenon of a lot of young Muslims, a lot of young Muslim activists as well, criticizing Islam and even like leaving the faith altogether on the basis that they say that Islam is quote unquote immoral, that God would not create a system possibly that is as immoral as this. And when I see that, it's like, well, you're just saying that Islam doesn't fit a certain set of morals that are quite different from what Islam proposes itself. This is like kind of alluding to the point you mentioned with human rights and the sticking points, and it's like a lot of Muslims have been washed over by this idea, completely covered in this idea of the human rights being the zenith of human morality and interaction.
Well, first of all, one has to go back, what do you mean by immoral? That morals are sets of values, ethics, arguably, which are grown up within a particular community and within particular traditions. So some of these evolve. Some of these evolve and they change over time. Others remain more embedded within communities. So I think one has to say, what do you mean by immoral, and to focus on the particular issue in question, because often morals may conflict just as human rights conflict. Now, if one talking about equality, or equality in all respects, if you interrogate the rights and principles, you'll find a whole number of potential contradictions there. And so you have to stand back from the discussion and to focus on the particular issues at hand, rather than saying or casting these generalizations, which often distort the whole debate. So get back to what's your problem? What's your issue? Let's deal with that issue. Of course, Islam is holistic, and we can't separate morals from rules, from governments, it covers everything. But in order for us to deal with what the person's issue is, then let's focus on that issue, and then we'll deal with it from there. So let's not deal with it in the abstract, let's deal with it in the concrete.
I think a good example that I've come across is how a lot of people are, I guess, outraged or disgusted at the young age of the Prophet's wife, Aisha, and how that informs so much of how they find Islam distasteful, repugnant in certain ways. But if you just look at the history of even the West, even England, America, the age of marriage is really low, just even 100 years ago. It only became an issue, I guess, with, I don't know, like the past 100 years with America and popular culture, and the age 18 becoming a thing where it became enshrined that you can't get married under a certain age. But throughout various histories and cultures across the world, getting married as long as 12, 13, 14 is completely normal.
Yeah, and they wrote, like the Christians wrote a lot of polemics about Islam. Like I was studying Latin or Spanish views of Islam during the Islamic Spain and during the Reconquista, and they wrote a lot about the false prophet, how he was a demon, so like all of these things that were quite ridiculous. But no one once mentioned the age of Aisha radiallahu anha.
Because it was common within their cultures
as well,
and it was even here in Australia, you had child brides, people who were sent with the convicts who were very, very young, and there were those who were 12, 13 who were married off to some of the convicts. And so it's something actually which was actually common here, but people don't like to reflect on those things. And this was not that long ago. Yeah. So even the whole notion of a child, what a child means, didn't develop in the West until the 19th century.
Yeah.
So the whole concept of what a child is new, it is historic. So we need to go back to those basic things. Now, Islam has protected the rights of those who are young and vulnerable, and only held persons to be accountable once they've reached a certain level of maturity. So, if generally speaking, if they were less than 15 lunar years of age, then they would not hold them accountable. Now, that's not the case that we are finding in Western jurisprudence today, that you have children who are sent to jail for a very long time. And they talk about the rights of the child, but in practice they realize there are some people who are technically speaking children, but they're doing some horrendous things which society doesn't accept. And so they manipulate the rules in various ways. So again, we have to interrogate the whole thing and to deconstruct what the argument is. So in relation to Aisha, yes, she was young. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, her father, would he have wanted his daughter to be molested, as many of these non-Muslim critics seem to be suggesting? No. He loved his daughter, and he loved her to marry the best of the creation. And it was nothing about sexual intercourse. It wasn't about that. And that she became, what did Aisha radiallahu anha become? She became amongst the most knowledgeable of women. And she was propagating the doctrines of the Prophet ﷺ. So with that, is that an indication of someone who was abused? No, they often they go against the one who abuses them. So this is refutation against those particular.
It really comes into a lot, I think, the idea in the West of trying to save Muslim women from their oppressive
They deny that women have agency. There's this idea that somehow women cannot choose to wear certain forms of clothing, that women somehow cannot choose to work in their home. And then there's this idea that why would a woman want to be a Muslim? It seems to be very perplexing for them. But women have agency.
I think it's a sort of internal contradiction of Western liberalism in a way, because they all say you can do what you want, as in people have their own agency, but when it comes to Muslim women, they close it off, which is their own sort of oppression, I guess. Whereas they're not allowing that, they're not permitting that agency to Muslim women. It's as if they're the ones diminishing their capacity in a way, instead of the Muslim.
This is the nature of movements. Movements have their own momentum and people who carry them. And if they think that you are somehow endangering that movement, then they'll draw the lines and begin to articulate arguments to exclude you, even though the logic doesn't defend them. And we see this in many other areas.
And speaking of those areas, I wanted to kind of segue into a discussion about how Muslims are treated, or how Muslims can interact with the legal systems of the West. So would you say that the Western, like we can just take Australia and England, for example, because I'm pretty sure the legal systems are quite similar. We have the idea of common law.
Yeah.
So how does common law interact with minorities? Does it accommodate for minorities? Does it accommodate for kinds of differences in morals, ethics and values?
What's interesting, the term common law goes back historically to the law that was common to the people. And so you had itinerant justices who went around the country in England, they did some original sort of anthropological work to see what were the rules being applied by the people in those particular areas. And then they brought them all together. So it became the law that was common. So it was customary. So it was based upon the customs of the people. So where the people are homogeneous, so it will reflect those customs. So the law will be homogeneous. Where, however, the people are diverse, then you'd expect the common law to reflect that diversity. Now, post-World War II, what we've seen is increasing migration to various parts of common law because they were more stable. Now, within that, there have been tensions and challenges as the habits, the customs and the rules of the majority have been put under pressure, and there have been some conflicts with new customs coming in, and to what extent the common law can actually embrace them, accommodate them. And to a great extent, we have seen degrees of living together, of tolerance and allowing each space to live, to breathe. But there are also some lines which are drawn, and at the end of the day, if you are a minority, you can't expect every single aspect of your belief structures to be manifested in that framework. So in a way, it's for the minority to navigate, to learn how to navigate and to interact. So so that's the challenge. It's a challenge that we're faced with. So common law is accommodating in the sense that it's open to custom, and there are certain principles of reasonableness. And what is reasonable is a very open-texted expression. Issues of reasonableness which allow certain aspects where it's not specifically mentioned before to then enter into the framework and the fabric of common law. So new customs, which can include Muslim customs, can be incorporated, theoretically speaking, within that body of the common law.
Would it allow Muslims or any minority to be self-regulating in their law, in a sense, like family law, personal law? Because I've heard in the UK, the Sharia courts or something of the sort.
I wouldn't use that expression.
Yeah, okay,
they're not courts as such. What you have are arbitration tribunals.
Yeah.
There's something called the Muslim Arbitration Tribunal, and there are Sharia forums where on Sharia councils.
And these are legally recognised in the UK?
Well, you have the Arbitration Act, which allows for them to be set up. So there is a legislative framework which is consistent, of course, with English law, which has enabled them to be established. And therefore, as they are formed by English law, they are accountable to English law. Okay. So in terms of any decisions which are made within these arbitration tribunals or within the councils, the arbitration tribunals, if any objection, the parties can go to the English law courts to have the decisions overturned. And in respect to the Sharia councils, they all rely upon the implementation, upon consent of the parties. So if the parties do not, both parties, if they do not consent, they have no force whatsoever under English law.
So it goes straight to English law instead of the arbitration council. Okay.
So it is. So you might say that here you have examples of Islamic law and Sharia being implemented under the form of English law, and that is given the framework for Islamic law to be implemented within the Muslim communities.
Why is there such a hysteria about it in the West, though?
Well, because they say that number one, women, in terms of the Sharia councils, for example, they say that Sharia law is being imposed upon women. And here again they say that Sharia law, by definition, according to them, is contrary to the interests of women and is going to oppress women. And so if you're in support of equality and gender equality, how can you support this approach? And that's actually what happened in Canada. So you had the women's movement and the feminist movement was successful in overturning the arbitration acts in Canada.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so you can't have family arbitration anymore in religious matters. So that just cannot happen. It still does happen in the UK. Here in Australia, we're sort of in a very loose situation.
I guess I wanted to transition from that discussion to a broader sort of dialogue about Islamophobia, because a lot of what prompts these movements to sort of dismiss these things as Muslim women as being oppressed by these arbitration tribunals is that they have this sort of latent Islamophobia sort of that they carry through and push forward. And I wanted to ask in a general sense, how is Islamophobia sort of carried through the legal system in a way that still discriminates against Muslims? Because in a certain sense, it's always sort of present. And even with the recent case, one of our students at UNSW who was imprisoned for terror charges, he got charged even though there was no evidence at all to support the charge. So he's smeared with that for life and he can't escape it. And the police don't really admit to anything. So it's sort of we know that there was a sort of motivation for that, and we don't know how it came about, but he's actually close to quite a few of the people at my university, and they're trying to raise more awareness about it. What would you have to say about that, sort of, especially in Australian law and that context we have here?
Law relies for its legitimacy on its neutrality.
Yeah.
So that's part of its rhetoric, that in order for it to be accepted by society at large, it must, perforce, be seen to be neutral. So if you had judges saying, "Oh, we're going to punish you because you're a Muslim," for example, then clearly it would not be neutral. And so judges would never, ever say that or ever admit to that. And there are good arguments to say that actually they don't do that in practice. However, there are various avenues throughout the system where discretion is applied. And where discretion is applied, then the values of the person, the values of the broader society, the tensions which are present within the society can be manifested in different ways. And the criminal justice system is a perfect example of that. Because the police, they have a lot of discretion to stop, search, arrest, although technically that should be on the basis of clear criteria, question, interrogate suspects. So, and within that, you may have various types of discrimination, including against Muslims, which might be applied. And so where Muslims are a threat or perceived as a threat, then you may have individual or groups of officers who apply that discriminatory criteria in determining who to stop, who to search, who to arrest, and then initially who to charge. Now, we would hope that the prosecutors, and when they had come to their decisions independently from the police, that they would exercise restraint and look at the evidence in a neutral fashion. See, okay, what is there evidence of any crime having been committed here? But also they have the discretion, and they may be thinking about how this may be perceived by the general public. They have a discretion as to the selection of charges, and they may decide, okay, no, we maybe for this one a more serious charge than what we could do. And judges also, in terms of sentencing and how they punish, they have a list of aggravating factors, mitigating factors. What are they going to regard as an aggravating factor? Oh, this person has applied a very conservative approach to their tradition, to their religious tradition. Well, now they're living in Australia now. They're not living in a village in Bangladesh or a village in Pakistan. I mention this because one of the judges in the UK took this particular example. And so they are then saying, in effect, that Muslims don't belong and that they should be assimilating into the local culture. So it's within this mechanism of discretion that the neutrality of the system is stripped there, in effect. So, and where Islamophobia is given room to breathe.
So pretty much you're saying at the levels of law enforcement and every step of the legal system itself, the personal prejudices and biases or motivations of the people who enact the law, they come through, as in they're manifested. They can come through. Obviously, that won't reveal itself in the codified language, which conceals the, I guess, that discretion, because it's all made to seem very legalistic, etc.
Yeah, because it needs to be seen to be neutral, and so of course, so you have a legal form which will mask something, the actual nature of the subjective nature of the discretion.
I think we can learn a lot from the experience of black communities in America, which is probably where that's most visible.
Absolutely.
In terms of how they choose to, say, stop someone's car and search the car under reasonable suspicion, which is completely up to the police officer. And I guess the law, the judge, handing out his sentences as well for the possession of certain drugs. Because I've looked a bit into this, as in certain forms of crack cocaine, I think it was in the US, you have a certain form which is more prevalent in black communities, then you get a much longer sentence than I think the solid form, which is more a suburban white phenomenon, which is much more expensive.
I often like to refer to the Boulder study in terms of the death penalty that was conducted in the United States by the University of Florida. And this was in the 1990s, and they found that if you were black and your victim was white, you were 4.9 times more likely to get the death penalty than if you were white.
Wow.
And also, black life was valued much, much less. Yeah? And so this is empirical, and the study was validated, and they had all sorts of variables, 113 variables, I think. So it was empirically a very, very strong study.
I suppose one thing that you mentioned, or an individual you mentioned before, and it kind of relates to an idea of how Muslims should engage with these systems, knowing that there are these undercurrents of kind of discrimination or dislike in general, perhaps. That one figure who is very important in calling for a sort of engagement is Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah, who you mentioned. And I just want to ask, what is his role in shaping the way that Muslims engage with legal, political, and just like the social systems of the West? And how does that compare with the kind of ideas of certain individuals in the Muslim community who we're all very familiar with, who would say, don't engage at all with any of these systems, don't even give them lip service, don't promote them, don't go to them. If you're going to say anything about them, then make sure you say that it is kufr it is illegitimate, and if you participate in them, then you are committing an act of kufr.
It's not my position. I'm not a spokesperson of Abdallah bin Bayyah. So, in terms of that, what I'm saying is only in terms of my understanding of his broad approach. So his broad approach is one of integration as opposed to separation. And that as Muslim minorities living in the West, there is a need to recognize the contracts that exist between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. So many came as migrants. You come as migrants, you went in through immigration control, and as a result, there are certain agreements that you have to abide by the laws of the country. And so within that, there are certain things that you are obliged to do and certain things that you must not do. And so you are already implicitly, because of that agreement, following certain aspects of the local law. Now, not all aspects of the local law in any event are contrary to the Islamic tradition, so which is also what he says. That if we were to look in more detail at Islamic prescriptions, that many of the values are the same as in Islamic law. The forms may be different. So sometimes we can use the form, also what he said, sometimes we may use the form of the local law to enforce our substantive requirements, our substantive law. So the form is different, but the substance is the same. So you can implement your Islamic rights and enforce your Islamic obligations through the local form. So this is the way that we achieve some form of integration. And of course, it may be that there are certain things which just cannot agree. And in the West, I'm not saying this is Shaykh Abdallah bin Bayyah's position on this issue. But certain people may say, I'm opposed to this particular rule and I'm not going to obey it. So you may have certain issues of civil disobedience. The notion of civil disobedience has been part of Western tradition also for a long, long time. And since World War II and the whole issue of do I obey an unjust law, that was brought up because of the Nazis. So there are certain types of rules which may be passed by the legislatures, which we may be morally bound. So going back to the issue you mentioned before about immorality, we will say morally and religiously bound not to follow it. So there may be some issues where you draw lines, others no. And there may be some things which are aspects of what we're already obliged to do in any event under our religion. So it's not a question of disassociation, it's a question of how we integrate within the local culture. And if we want our rules, our values to have more of an impact, do we think it's going to have a good impact and for it to spread through anger, through violence? No, it's going to spread through interaction with people, and as happened in the past. And if we are angry also, we need to go back to what the Prophet ﷺ said. La dara wa la dira. There is no harm in our religion and we don't reciprocate with harm. So what are we doing today? So that's one other thing. Another is, we may feel something makes us burn with anger, but the Prophet ﷺ also said, don't get angry, and you respond to these things appropriately, in a measured way, in a systematic way, and with reflection, with hikmah.
So in a sense, we should articulate our grievances and for our recognition of our rights through the common systems in place of
what is exactly?
Yeah.
This has been Bayyah's point, and it makes logical sense. How else are you going to think about it? What choices have you in practice got?
Yeah, well, a lot of people would say that one choice is to abstain completely from it all.
It's ironic you mentioned that because one of those very groups, I looked at one of the cases here in Australia, and he was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and actually he went to court to enforce his rights as a father. So there are certain things which you can't avoid because of the nature of the system, and so whether you like it or not, you have to engage.
But once again, I'm reminded of sort of the black community in America, because it took for them the civil rights movement, which involved, as you said, civil disobedience, riots, and lots of people shot dead in the 1960s with the Vietnam War. As in, that sort of turbulence was needed to create the space where something that was not recognized for centuries, say the equal status of black people in the communities, in institutions, as in they needed that sort of like political disobedience, I guess, to force or shock their government into being like, we need to recognize these people, otherwise the population is seeing the repercussions that, as in we're going against our own principles in a way. So I feel like in a more radical tradition, which the West has, you sort of need those moments of conflict where new spaces might be opened up. Not for Muslims per se, but it has happened.
I think that Muslims would definitely need that, considering the fact that we're going to, in our lifetimes, particularly Josh and myself, not to say that you haven't got a long lifetime, inshallah, you live a long and a healthier life. But we'll have quite a large minorities in several European countries. Some estimates even talk about a third of the population of Sweden being Muslim by 2050, 2060 if high migration rates continue, which I don't think they probably will. But in France and the Netherlands and all these countries Muslims will make up about 10, 15, 20% of the country. And that's larger than the African American community is in America. So perhaps, there needs to be some kind of movement from Muslims in order to, obviously not a uprising to restore caliphal authority as some people would have it, but a sort of to gain this recognition and to gain this kind of space, which Josh mentioned, for us to be mentioned, respected, and understood as equal members of the society, because
not discriminating.
Well, because look, I'm second generation Australian, and I'm born here. My parents, born here, and I don't. It's when people say go back, it's like, where would I go back to? I'm here, and like yourself as well. You're a revert, and do you have any idea how long your family were in England? They've just
no idea.
Perpetually in England, So it's very interesting, and it's like, well, we're here, we're native to this land, and this is Tariq Ramadan. Professor Tariq Ramadan, he made this point as well. It's like Muslims are now native to the West, and so we have to form a part of these Western discourses and Western discussions about law. And so, I do think that we will need some kind of civil, even disobedience, and a Muslim civil rights movement.
It's important to raise consciousness.
Yeah.
So but how you raise consciousness requires wisdom.
Yeah, definitely.
And sometimes when the broader communities feel threatened, then they can do some unimaginable things. And then we know from Bosnia, we know from Myanmar, and what happened in Africa, not Muslim, in Rwanda, you get, once groups feel threatened, they become incredibly tribalistic, and rationality doesn't come in. And we're now living in an age of populism, where these mass movements are getting more and more extreme, and they don't listen to reasoned argument. It's about emotion. And so if we get it wrong, which is the danger of being aggressive, if you get it wrong, it can have all sorts of repercussions, and the rights and protections that you had are pulled from under your feet. So it requires wisdom, reflection, before determining what types of acts to go forward with. But yes, we are here to stay as Muslims. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. We're 1/5 of the global population, and growing. I think the last thing I looked at, we were just about 22% of the global population, reflected across the world. It's increasing.
Just in reference to some recent work you had, which I was sort of hoping to discuss, sort of the idea of cultural defenses. So, like, how can someone, like, sort of convicted, I guess, say that they were motivated or, in a sense, compelled by religious injunction to do the things they did? Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Okay, I'll give you a good example. We know that if a child is not praying or not fasting by the age of 10 lunar years, the father or the guardian of the child, under the religion, following a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, is told to hit the child.
Yeah.
Now, And again, there are circumscriptions around this, and it doesn't mean you beat the child so that the child is beaten senseless and they don't know whether they're coming or whether they are going. But the idea is to instill in that child the recognition of how important these matters are. Mm. So it's for educational and transformative purposes, and should only be done with that intention in mind, not to physically harm the child. However, now we have the rights of the child, and for you to use any implement in chastising that child, and some jurisdictions are saying if you use your hand, even smacking, they're saying that this is contrary to the law. So what has become reasonable, what is reasonable chastisement, is now being seriously challenged. And so for Muslims who think that they are bidding the ma'ruf, prohibiting munkar, they find themselves before an Islamic court, for a secular court, be it in New Zealand, be it here in Australia, in Sydney, or in England, in the United States, or in Canada, and they say, I was doing what I'm obliged to do.
Is it a criminal offence to sort of beat your child?
Because they have committed an assault, violent assault. It's an imprisonable offence. And so, what would you say in this? What defence can you have? It's not self-defence. The only defence that you have is what's reasonable chastisement. So, can I bring in my culture to say that I believe there was an obligation to do this. I'm not doing it to harm the child. My intention was to educate the child. And there wasn't any permanent or lasting damage done to the child. And so here one might argue for a cultural defence. Now, as I said, the willingness of courts to listen to this type of approach can vary over time. And it depends where they see their values positioning in relation to this. Now we're living in the age of protecting children, and they may say, no, we're not going to allow any chastisement of the child, so no cultural defence for this.
Most of our listeners will be laughing at this because their parents, even including myself, like when I was a kid, I used to get a smack from my white socialist progressive family. Like even they would draw a line somewhere if I was. My mum used to pick me up actually when I was being disobedient as a little kid, and put me into my room, carry me into my room, and shut the door. And I would run from one end of the room and slam myself against the door repeatedly over and over and over again. And one time my mum, as I was about to do it, opened the door, so I just face planted on the ground and said, "This is what happens when you keep trying to resist." And I remember that. And as I said, I think I've turned out to be half decent, inshallah. God will decide that. But look, I don't think it's a particularly grave issue as it's being made out by the modern, and it's a very strange time that we live in, because even like our parents would never have thought of something like that, would they? It's
times change and positions and moral positions evolve. So this is something that is one of the challenges that we have today, and it's all within this Islamophobic environment.
It's just totally dependent on the cultural and moral frameworks that you sort of live under, I guess. And what's done inside the family home is, I guess, for a lot of migrants, still like the preserve of the previous culture that they brought, I guess.
Very much.
So they don't see it in that sense.
And it's perfectly reasonable for them to continue with their traditions and their values. So habits are habits because they've you've done them over a long period of time.
Yeah. And
for another country to expect you to radically change your habits when they never did, when they went overseas, it's rather...
Yeah, it's impossible.
Rather difficult.
And I think it just comes out to the fact that I turned out alright, and these things happened to me. I don't hold any grudges against my parents. I have a very good relationship with them. It didn't lead me to long-lasting trauma or anything like that. It was just, when you did something wrong, this happened.
Yeah, I feel like I've deserved a lot of...
When I reflect about like what I did, like going to the cupboard and just pulling everything out for the sake of pulling everything out, or messing up my dinner or my dad's dinner or whatever, just because I felt like it, You need to learn these lessons. And my grandfather is he's about 88 years old now. He's very much part of the old conservative Western tradition, and he genuinely wants the return of capital punishment, because he's like, pain stays in the mind of children. You can't give them a little metaphorical slap on the wrist and be like, whoa, this don't do this again. Don't, come on, pull up, or we're gonna put you on a behavioural plan. He said this didn't work. He wants the rattan brought in, and that leads. I think that the mention of the rattan brings me to a kind of part of the world that I want to focus on now. The rattan, yeah. So, which is basically like, for those who don't know, how would you describe? It's just a cane that they.
It's a cane. Now, there are different types of rattan. There's the very thick rattan, which is often used by the secular system in Malaysia for those who are violating immigration rules, for example. And so they whack these immigrants and they strip them naked. And this violates Sharia. So that's that type of rattan. And then there's a thinner rattan, which is used by the Sharia courts in trying to inculcate Islamic behaviour. And it's a lot thinner, and it doesn't inflict the same type of harm which the rattan from the secular system inflicts.
Yeah, and that leads me into Malaysia. And a lot of people discuss Malaysia, including in Islamic intellectual circles, as a successful kind of model for the integration of Islam into a kind of modern nation state. To what extent would you say that that's the case, in that it is a successful model for them?
Well, Malaysia is quite unique in that it represents a junction between different cultures and traditions. And so we have at least 3 ethnic communities who meet and engage or interact. And we have common law mixing with Islamic law, with the Sharia, and also with native law. So we have the indigenous traditions and have their own native courts. So this is all mixing. And so they have a pluralist legal framework. And so this enables different courts, different structures to implement various rules from those traditions. Has that been successful? Well, I'm not sure whether it's the right expression, but the jury is out on that one. That the problem where you have when you have more than one legal system within the same structure is that conflicts will arise as to, if you have one person and another person from a different tradition, and one offence committed against the other, which court will deal with that? Which law will be applied when you have people from 2 different traditions? How do you deal with those conflicts? And if a case can be decided in one tradition and another tradition as well, who decides? And it becomes a very political decision. And we've seen these types of political decisions causing some upset and concern in Malaysia. And so, again, it hasn't quite been able to deal with all of these yet. So this, again, as I was mentioning at the start, it's a work in progress. Malaysia is a country, it's a post-colonial country, which is still dealing with the legacies of the British and what the British left them. So the British totally denuded Islamic law. They stripped the Muslims of their Islamic law and left them bare. All they had was just the private law. So Islamic law as a public law was a non-entity. And so since their independence, we've seen an increasing application of Sharia in various forms. But because not all of Malaysia are Muslim, it's 60% Muslim, the other populations have felt what they call creeping Sharia. They feel that it's a menace for them. They feel threatened by it. So for Malaysia, again, to try to deal with that has been problematic for them. So they've had their challenges just as we have our challenges. And it's not a paradise. It's not a paradise. But is there a celebration of religious identity in Malaysia? I believe so. It's not hidden. Because here in the West, we have to hide our religious identity. We're not allowed to celebrate it. Whereas Malaysia, they do. In Indonesia also, they do. So this is part of the differences between East and West, maybe, and it's something that maybe here in the West, they could, if they really truly believe in diversity, then they'll see the value of religious diversity, and that then will enable Muslims to live more as Muslims here in the West and other religious communities.
I think that's very, very brilliant. I think that's something too that Erdogan is trying to do in Turkey. Just allow religion or a discussion of religion, like, yes, I'm a Muslim and this is what I believe and this is how it influences my life, coming back into the kind of public sphere and public discourse, which it really isn't in the West. And people talk about, I used to watch a lot of atheist videos, and a lot of atheists would talk about how they were discriminated against because in America, an atheist could never win. First of all, I don't think that would really be the case here. Atheists form the largest, atheists and agnostics form the largest group in Australia, and they're growing at a huge rate, like 5-10% each census almost. And so it's like, well, if I walked into an academic circle, like for example, the studies of religion department here, they're all atheists. If I walked into a political circle as an orthodox traditional Muslim, Sunni, and following one of the four madhabs and trying to implement that in my life, if I tried to bring this identity into any discussion or any kind of intellectual forum or political forum, I'd get shut down, I'd get laughed out of it.
Yeah, it's actually here in law. You're in a law school here. We've just done an essay in criminal law, and part of the criteria when looking at euthanasia and assisted suicide, and they said don't bring in religious arguments. You have to look at philosophy, you have to look at utilitarianism, you have to look at issues of liberalism and liberal values. So they're not saying it is relevant to even bring in a religious discourse, whereas, well, that's part of the lives of the communities. So you're asking us to, in fact, be what we're not, to think what we're, and not to think what we think. And we need to be more honest, and again to see the relevance of religion to these types of discussions. So the more you say it's not relevant, the more people who are religious are going to say, and to vigorously assert it is relevant. That will lead to more conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely the case. Even on Joe Rogan's podcast, he was talking to this very famous Islamophobic ideologue called Gadsad. I think that's his name. And Joe Gadsad was talking about how Islam is not, like Muslims should not be tolerated in the West because their values do not line up with Western values. And he said that Muslims can come and stay here so long as they remove certain aspects of their traditional beliefs from, the public discourse, basically. Like, we can't talk about these things, we can't act upon these things that are bedrock to our tradition, some of them. And Joe Rogan said to him, but if you tell people who are coming into these countries that they can't follow the word of God, their understanding of the word of God, you're just going to cause a huge reactionary impact. They're going to say, these people are telling us that we can't follow our word of God. This is wrong. We need to do something about this. We either need to fight this authority or we need to go back to where we are, and it's going to cause a ginormous clash of civilizations, if you like. Whereas I think a lot of the problems in the Muslim community and a lot of kind of radical voices in the Muslim community, I wonder if you agree, Josh, would kind of dissipate if the West was far more accommodating to our religious principles through the form of not just things like cultural defense, but just like what you mentioned, just letting us discuss our religious values and not have to mask it under the guise of philosophy or traditional beliefs. Like to say, I'm a Muslim, this is what Muslims say, this is what I contribute to this discussion.
I think what's important is for us to look for where there is a common vocabulary. Now, whether that means we have to strip our vocabulary of religious identities is a separate question. Now, there are academics and thinkers such as Abdallah and Naim and others who say that we need to apply the philosophy of John Rawls and talk about civic and public reason, that we should look for neutral concepts which aren't rooted in Islam, but which are common between Muslims and non-Muslims in order to have this public discourse. Now, I don't actually agree with this whole notion that we should be neutered. Because again, it would mean that 98% of the Muslims who don't think in philosophical terms, who aren't familiar with this type of vocabulary, are not going to be able to participate in politics, are not going to be able to participate in their communities in any meaningful sense. So, but there is a need for us to try to reach out and look for commonalities. And that will lead to a greater cohesiveness within the communities and mutual understanding. A ta'arruf, or mutual understanding, is a very important part of being a human being, and we're commanded to have to do ta'arruf from the Quran, Islamically speaking. So we look forward. We try to look for those commonalities.
I think a lot of it has a large part to do with the sort of interiority of religion in the West, where it's something to be almost ashamed of. Because, like you said, in Malaysia, and you could see similar examples in India, where there's a diversity of religions and everything is celebrated in the public sphere. Like all their religious rituals, it's like a parade down the street, and Muslims are slaughtering on the streets, and everyone sees it in open view. It's sort of like, I guess this comes back to the history of the West in a way. They've shorn religion off from any public display, where it's sort of been relegated to this. The only way you could sort of talk about it is in this philosophical way, this sort of very intellectualized way, and something obviously you practice in your private life as opposed to having any substantive presence in the public.
It's a very Protestant way of looking at things. This whole idea of rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's. So one separates church from the state, and the Calvinists, they saw within this the freedom of the spirit. And they said that we have to be separated from the state in order to be truly free. And so this was a certain Christian conceptualization of the relationship between the individual and the state, and also many economists today, they say that the success of Western economies is rooted in this. So there's a big push towards this approach, and it's not just Western as well. If you were to look at Japanese philosophy and Japan, again, this notion of public displays of religion
doesn't really exist yet.
It's all about internalization. Again, this is where you have true freedom, which is expressed within the self. So for us to say it's all about the West, well, maybe not. We need to look a bit more broadly. But yes, this is part of the problem which we need to address. That our religion is not doesn't have that separation between church and state. It's inclusive. It's holistic. We have much closer understanding with Catholics, for example, than we would do with the Protestants in some respect. So it's not something which is common with or specific to Muslims. So also we need to look at other religious communities and then how they are facing those same problems. And then together, as part of what some people put this interfaith movement, we can then have a greater impact as a collection of communities trying to say, look, we have needs, we have interests which need to be reflected.
As in, we shouldn't really see ourselves in exclusion as sort of...
Yeah, we're part of the border.
Yeah, we're part of how minorities sort of operate in the West.
Correct.
A lot of people have talked about these kinds of alliances between minorities and Muslims, forming alliances with different minorities because we do have that shared experience. But I suppose, I think this discussion of how much we can talk about Islam and talk about our Muslim, like being Muslim in very candid terms, it's like something that really we, us three particularly, don't necessarily have an issue with. You know, you and I are both from revert backgrounds, and so we actually know how to discuss these issues in ways that may not be as, not diluted, but just we can select our language a little more when we're speaking to certain audiences, because we know intimately how, for example, our family would react to certain statements when they don't really understand the symbols we use to decipher things. And I suppose how does being a revert, because I come from the same background, how does this kind of influence your identity and your what you bring to the discussion? Does it have an influence at all? do you think that it helps you to kind of understand both sides and bridge gaps? Or
first and foremost, don't actually accept the terminology of revert.
You don't?
No. There's a misinterpretation of the hadith.
Oh,
so that I accept the terminology of convert, and that I was a non-Muslim, I become a Muslim. And
I
so
think
that
Hamza Yusuf said the same thing.
Yeah.
Because revert implies that it's not a conscious step you have to take. Whereas convert, it's like you're being shorn off from your previous, as in it's much more active. It's like a different terminology.
I used to say convert. And then they corrected me and they're like, no, you're a revert. I'm like,
that's
okay,
like
I'm a revert.
a lot of the...
It's because they take a certain hadith and they interpret it in a literal way, but there are other hadiths and verses of the Quran which you have to cross-refer to. So the companions were not reverts, the companions actually were converts.
Converts, yeah.
They were converts. Okay. And so when we look at our transformation, let's look at it in that way. We have gone from a state of non-belief into a state of belief. And from that state of non-belief, there were certain aspects which we carry through into our lives as Muslims also. We don't jettison everything. So there are cultural attachments which will remain with us. And when we relate to the local communities, then we still have those things. And so the other Muslims won't have that. And so we're in a way a better position to articulate a message which is more understandable to them. And so we're in a privileged position in that respect. So we have a language, we have the cultural codes which to unlock various issues. But also you have to remember there is a difficulty for people like ourselves, and that we're seen as, it used to be called like race traitors and all that type of thing. So when you are seen as having gone native, quote unquote, that you're no longer treated as in a serious way. And also actually amongst fellow Muslims, when they find out, oh, you're a convert. So what made you convert? That's the question. Now, I've been a Muslim for 25 years. And for a person who is only maybe about 27, 28, or maybe actually less than that, to ask me, well, I've been a Muslim longer than you have.
Been alive,
they've been alive. So it becomes quite an interesting dynamic. And when you're always having to say why you are, and why you became a Muslim, and so on. So there are challenges and there are privileges from this type of position.
Do you think the Muslim community deals with converts in a particularly good and good way? Because I actually had a lot of difficulty early on. Like I had very little guidance, I had very little understanding. I think I've mentioned it like on every single podcast. But the first people who approached me were the hardcore Salafis, not like the moderate Salafis. Like I'm talking about, and Salafis will get angry at me for relating them, but they were Salafis and they were ISIS supporters, like the very extreme end of the Salafi movement. And then I had the Shia were the next to approach me, and I'm like, well, these first guys are wrong, so these guys must be right. And then I kind of went into that a little bit, and then it was only really through an exposure to certain people like Hamza Yusuf through the internet actually that I actually gained was grounded somewhat in the Islamic tradition. And so what do you think? Because you've mentioned a couple of points about how we're called reverts, not converts, and how that might be slightly undermining in a way, and how we're kind of asked the question, how did you convert? So how do you think the Muslim community is in dealing with converts?
It'd be different in the UK as well, I guess, compared to Australia maybe, because they have a much larger Muslim.
And different again if you live in a Muslim majority country and you convert there.
Our problem is that we come to Islam, or we understand Islam through our cultural frames. So whether you're an Arab, or whether you're Lebanese, whether you're Syrian or Egyptian, or the Arabs, they have their own preferences. And so if you don't adopt their own particular cultural habits or techniques, then somehow you're slightly different. And of course, here in the West, we have our various mosques, masajid. You have your Bangladeshi masajid, you have your Arab one, your Lebanese one, you have your Turkish one, and they're all culturally framed and rooted. And so the persons whom they refer to all from their particular linguistic and cultural traditions. And so it's almost as if you have to become Turkish, or you have to become Lebanese, or you have to become this particular culture in order to try to even take Islamic instruction. And this is the problem, that we've become as Muslims, so culturally rooted that we've forgotten what binds us together as Muslims. Arabic was the lingua, I apologize for the expression here, lingua franca amongst the Muslims. Whether you're from Albania, whether you're from Afghanistan, whether you're from Turkey, whether you're from Xinjiang, it didn't matter. That Arabic linked all of us together. And so that's fundamental. The other things are all basically optional. Yeah? That our cultures should be always looked at in flux. That it should be changing, and we adapt to our surroundings. Everything else doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. But we become fixated on it, and this causes exclusion. And I found that I was amongst quite a lot of Lebanese in England, and again, if you didn't really understand their mentality, didn't understand the way they're thinking, where they're articulating matters, well, you're sort of pushed away. You're pushed away. And so there is a sense of asabiyyah, or sort of tribalism, which infects the way Muslims behave today. And this is problematic for them. It's problematic for them. They'll be held to account for that in the akhirah. And also it's problematic for converts. So you have converts then setting up their own associations, their own groups, and that in itself is problematic. So you set up another tribe in effect. So are we just perpetuating this whole thing?
Whereas in reality it should be open doors.
Yeah. We should get back to our religious criteria and not to our cultural and linguistic criteria. And so I think this should be the way forward.
I'm not sure if you asked this, Raf, but about whether the Western principles of law have sort of their basis in Islamic.
Yeah, because
Islamic precepts.
Someone I was talking to the other day, it's actually a communist. They were like, "Oh, did you know that Ali ibn Abi Talib, he actually was a big believer in the rule of law, that as opposed to other khulafa, and that he was a big believer that the Sharia should govern as a transcendent idea, and that he was just partisan to that, and there were like independent judiciary as well set up in that time, and a couple of other ones you mentioned as well that kind of have parallels of the rights of children. You mentioned that how Islam enshrined the rights of young people, and the customary law as well, because the Muslims always had that, the Jews could go to the Jewish courts and the Christians could go to the Christian courts for family matters as well. So like a lot of these have a lot of similarities to the Islamic governance and Islamic law, don't they?
There's even something called the Atheist System in North Africa, amongst the Malikis. This derived from tawatur, the whole notion of persons knowing a fact exists when a large group of people have witnessed it with their senses. From hadith, we showed something is at tawatur. You have a large group of people who witness them at a given matter, and then they convey it in large groups until we get it today. So this system of at-tawatur was part of criminal justice in North Africa, and it was known as the Atheist System, and it comprised of 12 persons from the community. So as to whether a certain person was known as a bad person, then you'd have the Afif say, "Oh, yeah, we know this person has done all this," and so you'd have 12 who testifies to this. Now, the North Africans and the Malikis went to Sicily.
That's where restaurants is.
So the Muslims were in control of Sicily for a long time, and then after a while, the Normans invaded Sicily, and as well as parts of North Africa, as well as England and Wales. And some of their administrators, Roger II, I think, Roger I and Roger II, they incorporated Muslim administrators within their system. And then they took back some of these procedures from Sicily to England. So you had Henry II, who was known as an innovator, and from procedures such as trial by jury was a jury of presentment of, again, 12 persons began to be, some say, incorporated within decision making and mixed with other things. We had writs, also taken and brought from Sicily, and other types of procedures. So within the administration, you see the sharing of Islamic practices, and which would come from North Africa to Sicily, then transplanted from there into. So people think of trial by jury, for example, as being one of the most fundamental aspects of English criminal justice, and being high watermark of rule by law, of the rule of law. Well, there's an argument historically that its ultimate origins actually come from the Muslim world. Also, of course, they'll talk about Magna Carta and King John and certain things from there. Right to be tried by your peers. But things were happening before King John. And so certain practices, Muslim practices, were mixed with practices that were being applied in England.
I guess that sort of ties into Europe's rebirth, Renaissance, which a lot of scholars have similarly argued about how the philosophical thought of Muslim scholars were passed through Spain.
There's a lot of hidden history,
which
is now gradually being exposed. You talk about Sweden. Well, we're now finding that there are Muslim graves going back to Viking times.
I've heard about that.
I haven't heard about this.
Yes. And so there's been interactions with Muslims for a long, long time.
I think coins were found or something.
And also, in England, going back to before 1066, there are coins with the name of mentioning La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah, which were found in England. So one of the Saxon kings was said to have at least either he had become Muslim, or he had interactions with lots of Muslims and was using this currency for whatever reason.
Wow.
So there are all sorts of hidden histories which we're not yet fully aware of and which are waiting to be discovered.
I think we're running a bit over time, and we should probably wrap it up right there. But thank you very much, Dr. Salim, for all these insights you've offered us from a perspective of law and legal theory, which we're not really exposed to otherwise, because it's a very specialized discussion otherwise, especially about how Islamophobia is sort of carried through the law, because even Muslims, we have an idea of the supreme justice of the law in a certain sense. We don't understand how it all sort of bleeds through. But thank you very much. Thank you to everyone listening, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, please don't hesitate. Contact us through Facebook, Twitter, or Gmail at boysinthecave@gmail.com. Thank you very much, and from myself and my fellow co-host Raf, Assalamu alaikum.